Hey guys, Jennifer Weiler. Today I'm going to be showing you some graphite techniques that you can use when designing a simple small piece. We're also going to be talking about composition effects and how you can place the things you want to work with your design. The piece today is a small tattoo piece, and hopefully this will give you a better understanding on how to tackle something that is individual and specific for you. So first off, we have our materials. I personally like to use Derwent Graphite as well as my good old Bic mechanical pencil, can't go wrong with that. And I have two archival ink micron pens, which are just micro ink pens, and I usually prefer the 0.45 millimeter and the 0.50 millimeter. Now these range in all kinds of sizes depending on line thickness, so I'd recommend picking up some and trying them out so you can find which ones you prefer best. Derwent Graphite is a phenomenal soft lead that you can use for a lot of projects, and I'm going to show you how you can overlay graphite and ink to create a stunning visual effect. So you're going to start with a basic sketch. I chose bird, and that's solely for the simplicity of this project. You want to start with generally a very vague outline or rough placement idea, which is just going to be, this is where the beak goes, this is where the eye goes, this is where I want the feathers to be, this is how long I want the body, this is how wide I want the body. And this technique applies to anything you're drawing, not just birds. You have a mixture, at least in my sketches, of refined sketch as well as general sketch. You want to keep your sketches kind of light because you're going to be drawing over it, and if you do something that you may end up deciding later you don't want, you are going to want to be able to erase that pretty easily. And that's not always hard, easy to do because you've got a lot of grooves in your paper that don't allow for that kind of forgiveness when you push down really hard. It holds that graphite stronger than you might think. Generally, since this is a tattoo piece, I'm going to talk about the forward placement of anything with a face. You tend to want a facial expression to point towards the front of the body. So when this gets transferred, the expression of the bird and later on the viper face will point towards the front. This is just something that's usually done in tattooing, and it's something to consider, especially when you're working on your design work. It's not necessarily something you have to follow. As far as composition and placement go, I am putting in a flower, and I want the flower to be an extension of the bird without blending into the bird. So you want to transition without necessarily having a blatant interruption or losing the definition of the flower and the bird, which is going to be hard to do because we've got feathers and we have petals, which are very similar to each other. In this case, I have taken the flower petals and I have made their direction perpendicular to that of the birds. So you have the feathers that swoop down from left to right, and you have your petals that come from top to bottom. This creates a visual conflict which separates them, but also allows them to work together because it allows for movement throughout the piece, and the lines of your petals will carry through into that of your bird's feathers, and the bird will carry the viewer's eye into that of the snake skeleton. And you'll see how I wrap around that skeleton around the underside of the bird to allow for that movement of the eye. And this is really important because if you don't allow for that kind of movement, it can disrupt how a viewer looks at it. This is important in art. It's also a rule that can be broken. If you understand how composition works in a piece and how you can use lines, color, all sorts of things to disrupt, change, allow the fluidity of the viewer's expression and the viewer's eyes to move, you can also create whole new dramatic take on whatever it is you're drawing. Don't think about it as just a drawing, because it's not. It's more than that. It's a story, and you want that to translate well. So when you have these lines moving in the way that you want them, they can really work for your piece. And sometimes they can work against it. So you want to be mindful about where your lines go and what you decide to do with them. Playing with your composition is perfectly all right. You can see in the next, probably about the next 30 seconds of this film, about how I sit and can't really figure out what I'm going to do with the bottoms. So that's why I ask you to sketch lightly when you're first trying to figure out where you're going with a piece, because you never know where it's going to take you. And this preliminary sketch process allows you to decipher that. And it's a phenomenal tool if utilized properly. Like if you go in and you try bearing down with your pencil thinking that you can sketch that way, it's definitely going to backfire on you later if you decide against something. So now we have our inking process. Sometimes I like to ink before I do any of the finalization process, so this includes shading and anything coloring that gives it that dimension and that depth and brings that life out of it. But in some cases, I like to do the inking prior where I know I want some defining lines. In this case, I've got some filigree, I've got some really fine rib bones from the skeleton, I've got this outline to this flower that I want to accentuate, and that's just personal taste. This is just personal preference. You can use the ink however you feel necessary, and that can be just to enhance your darks and lights and the differences between them, create more separation where you feel there might be necessary, or you can just use it to outline and go crazy with it. Sometimes it can work against you, but generally, if you start lightly, you can always add more, can't always take away. That's definitely something to remember. Can always go darker, can't always go lighter. Okay, so you've got a sketch, you've got what ink you want laid down, and now you want to create that depth. Now you want to bring a little bit of that spunk and that life into the piece you've started. I usually like to start with a harder tipped or a harder lead pencil. In this case, I'm using an H. Now, your range of pencils is usually between a 9H to a 9B. And this is simply the softness and hardness of lead that you're using. Softer leads, which are the Bs, allow for a darker shading. This can also allow for a metallic look to the piece, which is not always in your favor, but sometimes it is. In the technique I'm showing you today with using a micron pen, it actually helps create some of that fuller depth and those deep, rich, dark tones without actually layering down a lot of graphite. So you avoid getting that metallic shine. Your H pencils on the opposite end of the spectrum are a harder lead, and this means that they go down a little softer in the sense that they don't go down as dark as your B's do. This is a great tool to start out with. As a reference, typical pencils like my Bic pencil, for example, that you see me using is a 2B. Those are usually what they're labeled as. Now when you're shading with something, a very good technique to practice with is shading with your light source, not shading against it. If you have, say for instance, this petal that I'm working on, and you want to create some three-dimensional depth there, use your pencils in a manner that follows the way the light is reflected on the surface. So if you see that your petal is making kind of an upward motion, like it swoops in and curves up with how the light hits it and with how it's shaped, follow that shape. Going against it doesn't always create that look you're going for. However, in the case of hatching and cross-hatching, it definitely can. And that is a technique of using overlapping lines to create your shading without using these blending techniques. Now, what I'm using right now is I'm using harder and softer leads to blend together. And you make subtle, soft changes. It takes a little longer than hatching and cross-hatching, but hatching and cross-hatching can create some really great texture, and you'll see me use some of that later in the bird. But for right now, I want my flower to be very soft in contrast to the ruffle of the bird's feathers. So for now, I'm going to use just a simple basic blending technique between my 2B, my 9B, and my H. All set with the flower, we're going to move on to the bird. I usually love to start with the eyes and the face. It's usually where you're going to see me start with almost any piece. Just gives me a good reference point to go off. This is just personal preference. You can start wherever you feel most comfortable. Same technique applies. Since I'm going to have some darker values in the bird, I want to lay down some of my basic shading with my darker lead pencils, with my softer lead, my 2B. You don't want too much of a buildup of lead at first because then it won't allow you to add things on top of it later. So this is why I'm starting instead of like with the H like I did with the flower. This is why I'm starting with my mechanical pencil. And it's okay to scribble. I can't tell you how many times you're gonna, especially in this video, you're gonna see me when it comes to feathers. You can be incredibly picky and it will take you a very long time. And sometimes I do like to be very picky. For the purpose of this project, I chose not to be. And you'll see me use a lot of the hatching and cross hatching to just make some quick general reference shades so I know where to come in later with some heavier values. Don't worry if you haven't gotten things quite as dark as you want them to. Right now, as you can tell, there's not much differentiation between my values, and that's because we're going to apply a trick later with the micro pen after all of our graphite's laid down so that it can really make all those little details pop out. So in this snake, we've got a lot of really tiny, small, intricate spaces. This is really complicated when it comes to tattooing. It looks great on paper, but it doesn't always translate well into a tattoo. And even though it is definitely possible to do it, they don't always age well. If you're someone that loves your sun, doesn't love your sunscreen, you're going to have a problem with it really quick. So a good suggestion is don't worry about the background, like doing the teeth behind the front rows of teeth. You're going to see me right now filling all of that in, and just make that solid black. Don't worry about it. Looks fantastic when it gets tattooed, and it also ages a lot better. This of course depends on how you take care of it, but it's also a little bit of an artistic trick that can help it age better as well. If you're just working on the piece, just to have a cool piece and it's not tattoo related at all, by all means keep using these tricks, but instead of filling in these darker areas and pushing them back with some solid blacks and some really heavy dark graphite, by all means continue the way you're going, and you can actually draw in every single one of those teeth in the back of the mouth if you really want to. Now I'm working on snake bone, and if you've ever seen it in person, it's very fragile, very thin, and in many places you can almost see through parts of it. So I don't want to go too overboard on my shading because I do want to keep a little bit of that realistic nature to it. I am, however, going to accentuate the bones behind it to give it some more depth. This is something I cannot stress enough, is don't be afraid of your values. And that's something to remember both with graphite and ink as well as your color. Don't be afraid of it. Definitely start light and then get darker, but don't be afraid of your values. So you've got the piece, you've got it everywhere you want it to be. That's fantastic. Now we're going to add a little bit of depth to it. Micron pen and ink are a great way to really make your image stand out, to really accentuate those differentiating pieces of your design so that it doesn't look like just one big giant graphite image. And it also doesn't look like a slate of graphite if you hammer down the graphite too hard and then you've got that really incredibly metallic sheen to it. Overlaying micron pen as one of the final steps ensures that you're going to get some really great values without going overboard. I usually try to refrain from using it in organic places, and I like to use it in more rigid, straight lines because it really helps to define those lines and really makes them stand out. But if I'm going to use it in an organic fashion, I like to apply the hatching and cross-hatching techniques so that I still have that organic feel without you seeing much of the line of the micron pen. because this pen goes down heavy. So you've got all of the micro pen where you want it. This is a 9B pencil. It is one of the thickest and it is the softest lead. It's going to go down like butter to paper. So I use this as a way of kind of covering up all of my quickie lines from my micro pen, and it also helps to blend down the micro pen into the earlier layers of graphite. This really creates for some subtle differences that'll make a big difference for your piece. Guys, don't be afraid of your values. I can't stress that enough. Don't be afraid to lay it down. Always start light and go dark, but don't be afraid of getting dark. Because you're differentiating values and having that kind of contrast really does great things for your piece. And lastly, don't forget to sign it. So hopefully this tutorial has given you some different exposure to techniques that you can use when applying them to your own designs. I will be posting some more on tutorials with color, as well as how to implement some of these same techniques with color. If you've got pieces you'd like to share, be sure to share them below. And if you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to get to those as well. Please comment, and maybe I'll make a video. Thanks for watching, guys. Bye.